Association vigorously describes how his administration is fighting communism abroad and at home. And then he
says, all right. Otto, my man.
What's going on, Peter? How you doing today?
Dude, I'm doing good. It's a pretty wild night. We are recording this on the 14th of July. Very fateful day, I think history will prove, but we're not here to talk about that really. Otto, what are we here to talk about? This is the first episode of Bush War, I guess we're calling it. Is that the name of this?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good name for the series. I mean, that's what it's called. Africa is the bush, is what they call it.
They do call it that. That is a fact.
A lot of Zimbabwe is the bush. And so to further, get into it. I mean, we're here to talk about the Rhodesian Bush War, something that's, it's thrown around a lot, whether it be, milsurp, firearms, or just kind of like, general right-wing politic. A lot of people like to latch on to certain countries, and like LARP is, I guess, the best word. You see a lot of the times with Prussia. But we're not here to, give you some kind of like mythologized, version of what went on in, the southern part of Africa from, the 1950s to, basically 1979. We're here to tell you about, more or less what actually happened, and, not really give you any kind of, we're here to tell you the truth as far as we can, the test.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting war because, you like you said, it is mythologized. I was in the military. I can't tell you how many times I would see guys at the gym wearing like Rhodesian bush stroke camouflage, like shorts, going to the gym. Like everybody, it's very mythologized, but there's actually very little, I guess, scholarly information out there. There's only, maybe a dozen books written. Most of those are not super accessible. So I'm glad we're doing this. Maybe we'll shed some light on it. But why don't you hit us with the intro? Explain to us, set the scene for the Rhodesian Bush War.
Alrighty. So with the conclusion of the Second World War, the new trend of global affairs was the complete replacement of anything resembling what was in terms of politics and the nations of the old world. By that, I simply mean that, there was an older way of life, an older way of existence that existed before World War I, World War II. And, the birth of modern warfare essentially changed everything, whether that be in terms of fighting or in terms of, just generally real politic and, the world in general. The collapse of Central European powers such as the Austro-Hungarians and Germany, resulting from both world wars, laid the groundwork for a world where the United States and the USSR would fight over global supremacy, consolidating all their interests to boil down to this simple idea of capitalism versus communism.
Right.
During this time, the redrawing and rearmament of the continent of Africa would undergo significant stressors resulting from both decolonization and the movements of the Cold War. As the old European empires ceded control to the native governments, factions in those countries would set themselves to work attempting to make Africa align to the interests of the free world or the Iron Curtain. Of these political events, none can compare to the allure, drama, violence, and duration of the Rhodesian Bush War. The Bush War started in 1964, lasting to the final month of 1979, in other words, December of 79. The Bush War presented a unique opportunity for whites to embrace decolonization, but at the same time, it was to gain their own power within Africa, mainly fighting for all they really knew at the time, against, groups that maybe originally wouldn't have been communist, but were more or less persuaded by communism as a polar opposite to what they saw as their people that were overlording them unjustly. I don't mean unjustly in a sense of, unjust practices in a sense of the plain term. I mean that in the sense of any group that has some, random group living in their country that is not from there and they're a minority, they're going to feel a little, kind of at odds with them. And the way most people, work is if the people they dislike go one way, they go the opposite way. And communism was the complete opposite of everything the white Rhodesians, believed in.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a and we'll get into the timeline here in a second and dig into the colonial history of Rhodesia. But yeah, that is really like when you look at the state of Rhodesia at the time of the outbreak of the war, um, you see, like you were saying, the destruction of kind of an older world order in the name of political enfranchisement. Something the Rhodesian state always existed on minimal enfranchisement of the supermajority black population of native Africans. And the government was virtually entirely controlled by white Rhodesians. Yeah, in the post World War II order, of mass democracy and, majority rule that was ill-fated, that was not going to stand. It was tenuously existing. And really, as we dig into it, I think people will see, the relationship that the Rhodesian government had with the British Empire as the Britons were willfully giving up their empire in the name of American hegemony and mass democracy. That really is the origin of the Rhodesian Bush War. But well, do you want to go ahead and talk about the you want to talk about 1800s Rhodesia? What was going on in Rhodesia
Yes,
in
I would.
1800s?
I would like to push this back a little further, just to kind of set the scene. So we all, kind of, in history class, in high school, I always wondered about, well, Africa's part of the old world, but why did people not even, why did Europeans not go there first? Why did they just jump across to the Americas? Well, I guess to clear up the misconception with that, they did go there first. We see the Portuguese in, the 20s, fighting wars in North Africa against the Muslims, essentially, trying to take places like Madeira. They took Madeira. I can't give you the exact year, but that sort of started European colonization of what I would say is Africa. Um, and they would push down, further south over time. And sorry about that. I heard something outside and it kind of threw me off for a second. But anyway, regardless, um, so they're slowly, pushing down and taking territory, and eventually they get down to southern Africa, not what would be the proper nation of South Africa entirely, but southern Africa, below the equator. Countries like Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique. Uh, the Dutch get there too, and they set up trading colonies in what is South Africa. And during the American Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, the British government is going to, make moves against those colonies, to take them over. And during the Napoleonic Wars, the British will take Cape Town. They will push the Boers up into northern Africa to form the Natal and the Orange Free State. And I know that doesn't cover Rhodesia, but it's going to play into some background of where they get their ideas. So, we all know the Zulu Wars happened in 1879, and the British, are pushing into Zululand to get diamonds. Is what they're after. I mean, Africa is known from its diamonds. I mean, I think we all know that, whether we watch Blood Diamond or we just think of stereotypes. And that's going to prompt British industrialist Cecil Rhodes to want to expand. They want to expand the empire and also, grab more power on the continent from, the French, the Portuguese, the Germans, the Italians. Everybody's there, and they're there, but they're trying to prevent a war. Um, this is I don't know if it plays directly into it, but we're seeing, a world where we're just coming out of, the Italian wars of unification, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, and people are starting to see the, what at that time was modern warfare. In between the, the Civil War or the Industrial Revolution, more properly, and World War One, the European mindset is sort of to prevent war. I know the Franco-Prussian War is going on in Europe during this time, but the idea is sort of, sensible Christian Europeans don't need to be killing each other. Um, and that's sort of the idea is these European countries are going to take these blocks of Africa and, not, fight each other. They're going to do it properly. So Cecil Rhodes is, British magnate, not magnet, but magnate. He's going to go he's going to go, get the idea to go and push into what is, modern Zimbabwe, or what we would call Rhodesia, bearing his name, obviously. And he's going to go take that and, set that up as a colony. Um, you have more information, I believe, on some of the people living there at the time, and just some of the general, the first wars, such as the Matabele Wars, and things like that, that, you could speak more on than I could.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's important to kind of set the stage about what um, Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, the various tribes that were living there at the time. So I can actually pull up the slideshow here. So this is a picture that I photocopied out of one of the books that I have. I will reference this book. It's called The Rhodesian War, A Military History. It's part of the Stackpole Military History series written by Paul L. Moorcraft and Peter McLaughlin. So in this image here, the yellow nations the yellow regions in the eastern part of Rhodesia are primarily Shona peoples, and the Shona lived in that region for a much longer period of time. In the west, you see the red portion there, and that is the Matabele tribes, or the Netabele, depending on your pronunciation. I think that the technical, like the native African pronunciation is Netabele, but the kind of anglicized version is Matabele. Doesn't really matter. The important thing to realize here is that the Matabele are an offshoot of the Zulu. So they actually moved north from the lands we would traditionally associate with the Zulu people, like from the Zulu Wars in South Africa. And they moved northwards. I don't exactly have a great timeline on when that happened, but culturally speaking, the Shona are a more agricultural people, and the Matabele are a more warlike people. And so at the time when British colonization of Rhodesia chartered with Cecil Rhodes was happening, the primary political force was the Matabele. King Lubengula of Matabele land was the sovereign of that region, and he was the one that the Englishmen were actually dealing with while they were colonizing the region. So in 1888, Cecil Rhodes got mineral rights through one of his diplomatic parties that he sent to King Lubengula. Cecil Rhodes was not physically there, but they went to King Lubengula, and the document that was signed that granted Cecil Rhodes and the British South Africa Company mineral rights to Matabele land was called the Rudd Concession. And so it's often said that Lubengula was kind of tricked into signing the Rudd Concession, and they didn't necessarily understand what was being signed. The historical veracity of that claim is kind of debatable, but more or less what is said is that there were oral agreements made to King Lubengula from Cecil Rhodes's emissaries that were not included in the actual document, and things basically saying that there would be a minimal number of white people there, that the workers actually extracting minerals would primarily be King Lubengula's own people. There wouldn't be a whole lot of white people there, basically saying orally, this was agreed upon allegedly, that there would not be some kind of full colonization, full takeover, that they were just getting the mineral rights. They were going to send some people to set up the mines. He was going to get a nice cut out of it. His people were mostly going to be working it. That was what is allegedly agreed upon orally. The actual document basically gives the British South Africa Company blanket mineral rights to all of his area. And in the lead up to the first Matabele War, what happened was King Lubengula was kind of reneging on his agreement. He had like chiefs underneath him who were saying that, hey man, you just signed away your entire country and you don't even realize it. So in the original agreement, he was supposed to be getting hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition. He was going to be getting tens of thousands of rifles. They were going to give him a steamboat on the Zambezi River. So this was a really good deal for him. But then, you know, he had people underneath him who were more or less planning a coup to take out Lobengula and fight the British. And so in response, you know, hostilities kind of erupted when the British actually started moving into Matabele land. So in 1889, the royal charter from the crown was granted to the British South Africa Company. And then in 1890, the following year, the Pioneer Column sets out. It's what it's called, is the Pioneer Column, basically a mixture of civilian workers and military folks from the British South Africa Company, moved north from South Africa, what we would call the Transvaal region, north into Rhodesia. And they had some slight contacts with the Matabele, but King Lobengula at this point was very much trying to rein in his men and his warriors, trying to prevent the outbreak of outright hostilities, because he knew that he could not survive a war with the British, even though he thought at this point and was convinced that he had basically signed away his country and was very concerned about it. He was trying to take the diplomatic route and avoid an outbreak of war. But a couple years after the Pioneer Column had gotten there and established mines, in 1893, the first Matabele War breaks out. And basically what happened was there was a raiding party, a Matabele raiding party that had gone to exact some tribal, I guess you would say, discipline, and on a Matabele tribe, or on Matabele village rather. And in the violence that ensued, some white folks were killed, some of the white Englishmen. King Lobengula did not intend for this to happen. It was basically a complete accident, but things very, very quickly spiraled out of control. And for the next year, the first Matabele War was being fought. Notably, the Battle of Bembezi, which, if you've ever heard, there's an album called Troopy Songs that you can find on Spotify, which is part of like the mythology of Rhodesia. You know, there's a very famous song about the Battle of Bembezi on the first day of November in 1893. Basically, the British wiped out the Matabele. As the song goes, the bravest of the brave were no match for the Maxim guns that the British had, and the Matabele got absolutely, they got wiped out. Also, another kind of important, interesting anecdote, the Shangani Patrol, or what's called Wilson's Last Stand, which is basically like the British equivalent of Custer's Last Stand. There was a scouting patrol that went up to try and make contact from the British. They were trying to make contact with the Matabele warriors, and they ended up being surrounded, and they killed something like 500 of the Matabele warriors, but all 34 of that patrol under Alan Wilson were killed, minus 3, 2 of whom were Americans and 1 of whom was Australian, I believe.
Yes.
Actually escaped and made it back.
If I could cut you in on that, I have some details on those men. Well, one of the gentlemen that was in that patrol was none other than Frederick Russell. I always get his name mixed up. It's like Frederick Russell Burnham.
Burnham.
I know it's Frederick Russell, and I always want to call him Bingham, but that'd be Hiram Bingham, the guy that discovered Machu Picchu. But it's like, I just get him always mixed up in Robert Baden-Powell.
Oh yeah.
Burnham and another man named Pete Ingram and William Gooding. Gooding was the Australian, and Burnham and Pete were they were the only Americans. Pete was from Montana, and I think Burnham was from Iowa or Nebraska. I can't remember. It doesn't exactly matter yet, but he's a man deserving his own video. But they were sent to go. They were sent away from the patrol. I can't remember the exact details, but it's kind of like a hand of God thing, sort of like if you know anything about the Alamo with Juan Seguin, who was one of Sam Houston's top guys during the Texas War of Independence, they got sent away and were supposed to come back to the patrol. And when they got there, they ran into a party of Matabele, and they fought them, tried to fight them off to get back to the patrol, and they just realized, okay, we can't get this. But then it's kind of also too, like you said, with Custer's Last Stand. You know, the men at Custer's Last Stand that were not part of Custer's company, they saw the fighting happen. They knew it was happening, and they basically kind of came to the conclusion there's so many Sioux that Custer and them couldn't have survived. And it's the same way with this. You know, Burnham, sees there's so many Matabele, and he's like, okay, well, first off, we can't even fight our way back to our guys. But number two, it doesn't even matter. They're dead. There's nothing we can do. So that sort of plays into the mythology of the nation of what would become the nation of Rhodesia. And for the whites, there is this sort of heroic sacrifice, and that the fact that the survivor was somebody that would go on to basically be the founder of the Boy Scouts.
Yes, that's a
Yeah,
major point about Burnham, is that he literally wrote the textbooks for what would become scouting, and he did help found scouting schools in England, and was a major influence on the scouts in America as well, which is a big
yes.
thing in the early 20th century. Yeah.
He also prevented, and this is off topic to the point at hand, but I guess it is Providence wills his way. He also stopped an assassination on kind of fitting, kind of stopped he stopped an assassination on President Taft when he was down in Mexico. He was there. I don't remember if he was a Texas Ranger at the time or he was with a posse of Texas Rangers, but they basically picked up that there was a gunman in the crowd, and they were able to disarm him and stop that. The Mexican authorities were clueless to it.
That's fascinating. Yeah, you
Yes.
are right. Burnham is a character who deserves an entire video of his own. Yeah.
Literally born during and hid under a basket while the Sioux Indians were trying to kill his family. Died in a hospital in Los Angeles in 1947. So,
What a guy, man. What a
like,
guy.
he lived it all. He lived it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there's actually sketches that you can find out there that he drew during his scouting missions in Africa. And he was fantastic sketch artist for what it's worth. But there's sketches that you can see that he was out there sketching things on while he was on these patrols with 3 or 4 guys out in the middle of nowhere, 3 or 4 guys and a couple of horses in the middle of Africa, literally mapping the African interior of places like Rhodesia and other places. So yeah, fascinating character.
Yes, and he does deserve his own video, and I would like to maybe one day talk about him because
Yeah, absolutely.
he's based off the character of Alan Quartermain is based off of him, I believe, too. If you know anything about King Solomon's Mines or
Oh yeah.
the Quartermain series, there's a bunch of it. But anyway, we'll move on to the more pressing topic at hand, which is early Rhodesian history.
Yeah. Oh, well, so the first Matabele War ended. I mean, we're not really interested in the tactical strategic details of that war, but basically King Lubengula, I believe, dies in exile. And basically the British South Africa Company solidifies their control of Rhodesia, at least for a while. The second Matabele War began in 1896, so just a few years later. And the second Matabele War is also called the First Chimaranga. I think that's the correct pronunciation, but the word Chimaranga means revolutionary struggle or uprising. And that's going to come into play again in the Rhodesian Bush War in the future, because the first Chimaranga is the second Matabele War, where basically, the Matabeles were trying to take back control of their country from the British South Africa Company. It did not go their way. Interesting note, if you'll permit me to go on a bit of a tangent.
Yes, go on a tangent.
Yeah, so the Jameson raid. I don't know if you're familiar with the Jameson raid, but the Jameson raid was basically the Rhodesian settlers had gone on a raid against into South Africa, and the details of that raid are not really prevalent to what we're talking about. But basically, all of the military force in Rhodesia was gone on the Jameson raid at the time when the Matabele began their uprising in the Second Matabele War, the First Chimaranga. So the kind of farm attacks that were common in the Rhodesian Bush War, you can draw their origins as a tactic to this First Chimaranga, because all of the military force was gone. So you had all of these isolated white farms, white mines that were being attacked by the Matabele rebels during the First Chimaranga. Also notable was the siege of Bulawayo. So Bulawayo is the major city in Rhodesia, captured from the Matabeles, but then became basically the capital of Rhodesia during this period. Because they didn't have any military force for extended periods of time, there were not only Bulawayo, but other cities were basically put under siege by the Matabele. And eventually the sieges failed, and the Second Matabele War was won by the Rhodesians, and again solidified their hold on the territory. But I think it is notable to talk about these tactics, and even going back to when we were talking about the outbreak of the First Matabele War, an important thing to understand is the kind of the cultural way of war of the tribal groups in Rhodesia and in Africa in general. It was very much an older way of war. I've been reading Caesar's Conquest of Gaul, actually, and you can see that this is the kind of tribal warfare where, if you go to war with another tribe, you're not just going to war with their warriors, you're going to war with them. So what we would call genocide was basically commonplace. Men, women, children, villages, these are legitimate military targets in this kind of traditional tribal warfare. And so you see that here in the First Chimaranga, where they are attacking farms, they're attacking women, they're attacking children. But that was commonplace in Africa. And so, I think it's important to note that, because when we start looking at the actual Rhodesian Bush War in the 1960s and 70s, as a Western observer, we might say, oh, wow, it's so terrible. These terrorists are going around, they would call them the terrorists, right? The black nationalist groups going around and committing what we would say are war crimes against white settlers, but put in the cultural context of tribal warfare in Africa, and is less than a century from the First Chimaranga to the Rhodesian Bush War. It's really not, out of place. So I would encourage people, when you're looking at history and when you're looking at military conflicts, not to apply what you might call, interpersonal morality or kind of Western morality onto a war. I think it's better to just look at it kind of objectively, you might say. So interesting note there, I would say.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Especially with the stuff going on in the Middle East right now. Not going to go into details on what and where, but we saw an attack like that quite recently, and a lot of people were upset about that, and I kind of my kind of view on war is sort of make do what you personally believe is the right call. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's like, you're going to be mad because somebody struck you. You're not. It's not the fact, oh, that they struck our women and children. Oh, like they're dogs. They're heathens. They're infidels. And your side goes and does the same thing. Um, Really, it's basically, in war, all fair's, what's that saying? Like, all's fair in
Yeah,
love and
all
war.
is fair in love and war.
You
Yeah, and
know,
I think it's important to note too. I mean, as Americans especially, we kind of have an idea of war as being something that happens in other places, So Patton's Third Army marching through Europe, they're on a campaign. They're doing legitimate military operations in some far-flung place. When you're talking about wars for the place that you live, when you're talking about the Matabele fighting the Rhodesian whites, for the future of their country in their traditional homelands, um, you know, all war in that context is effectively genocidal to one degree or another. Again, I'm not like condoning any of this, but you see these same tropes play out again in the Rhodesian Bush War. This isn't just a military campaign. This isn't just a war being fought somewhere. This is people's homes, people's traditional lands, you know. So much the same thing that you saw in America in, you know, the Western expansion, right? So for what it's worth, important to
Yes.
note, I would say.
Yes, and you know, and the thing with that too is, and we'll probably get to it in later episodes, that you know that you know people want to, you know, with these grand narratives of, you know natives versus Westerners. I'll use that in a vague term, and you can maybe come to like any kind of conclusion you want to on that. It's not supposed to be specific. Um, it always seems like one side claims, oh, this side did wrong, this side did right. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's not really you. That history will move on, regardless of who's alive at the end of the fighting. It's basically, can you win? And I know, you know, in America, especially where I live, um, fighting with the natives is probably a lot worse than what it was out west. I'm going to go ahead and make that stand. Um, it was organized. It was g- genocidal on the level of, well, both sides are going to go into a town, kill everyone they see, take scalps. You know, whites took scalps too. Um, burn their homes, destroy it, and build on top of it. Yeah, I mean, I know of a place where the Indians massacred everybody in a fort. Um, everybody. Well, Revenge Andrew Jackson goes and burns a village down to the point where, his army was starving, that they, you know, were taking, you know, the like the liquid of the burning bodies in these huts, these houses, and using it to cook their food. And that's war. That's war.
And I
Wars.
think it's especially like important. This isn't just war. I mean, this is we're stepping back into an older era. I mean, this is something that even our grandparents and our great grandparents didn't have a firsthand experience of, right? Um, you know, even World War One was gentlemanly compared to these kinds of wars. I mean, King Lubengula, for example, you can find pictures of him online. Rhodesia at this time period, I mean, this is about, I mean, basically a Neolithic people, right? Um, the the Matabele were fighting primarily with assegai, which are you know, spears and shields. You know, think Zulu, the movie Zulu. Think that, right? Their clothes are what you might think of as being traditional tribal clothes. Their huts, their villages are mud huts. So, I mean, we're stepping back into an older era when we're talking about this early colonial period of Rhodesia. So, kind of leave your modernist priors where they are when you're thinking about these things.
And then, you know, another note I'd like to go back on that before we continue is, you know, you have to also think too. You're talking about things like the Jameson raid, etc. And, you know, a lot of people they don't they don't really think, I think, in a sense of the Anglo, mind of going to war, either as, we like to imagine it as, these are professionals, these are soldiers, but, you know, like the Jameson raid, the Matabele War, you know, these aren't British redcoats. You know, this is like Cecil Rhodes, you know,
Right.
mercenaries. I mean, this is the equivalent of men. I mean, this is essentially 1800s choreos, if you know what I mean by that. This is a war band of whites, a war band of, you know, Anglos, you know, going out to, you know,
Yeah.
do what they, you know, we as a people have done for thousands of years. I mean, you kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of it. You know, one side's got spears, one side's got guns, but, you know,
Maxim guns.
yes, Maxim
Yeah.
guns, Maxim guns, lots of them. But they, at the end of the day, you know, every man is a fighter, every man is a warrior when it comes down to it, and every man is a part of the war band. But
Yeah.
further than that, we can continue.
Yeah. Yeah. So in 1901, there was they call it the Mapandera Rebellion. Basically a minor skirmish, went absolutely nowhere. Don't even have to touch on it any more than that. It was basically like the first Chimaranga Part 2, except it was like 600 Matabele guys tried to start a revolution and it went nowhere, like I said. Um, Following that, Rhodesian involvement in the First World War was minor but notable. I think there was somewhere between 800 and 900 killed in action of all races, so white Rhodesians, but also Black Africans who were conscripted or volunteered to fight in the First World War.
Yes.
Um,
There was
and then,
about. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Go
no,
ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say that the total numbers from what I could gather on Rhodesian volunteers and servicemen for World War One was roughly 5,000 whites and 2,000 blacks. Actually, yeah, that's where I was going to go on that. I'm trying to not get my notes mixed up for World War One and World War Two, which we'll hit
No,
on World
yeah,
War
yeah.
Two here in a bit.
Yeah, well, the next thing I was going to talk about, which is really the next major political development, is the transition from the rule of Rhodesia being in the hands of the British South Africa Company to becoming an actual formal colony of the British Empire, which is a difference. So, I mean, people I'm sure have heard about the Dutch East India Company, the British South Africa Company. These private corporations during the colonial period, even going back into the 1600s, were the foundation of European colonialism. So it wasn't really like the British government proper was going out here, there, everywhere and establishing formal colonies under the British crown. And you see this in America too, right? Every single charter that was granted to settlers was not done as a formal organ of British government. It was done as private groups of people, companies, going out to settle for religious purposes or for economic purposes, but they were private companies. So in 1923, British South Africa Company rule ends and it becomes the colony of Southern Rhodesia under the British Empire. So from 1890 to 1923, British South Africa Company, 1923 becomes a colony of Southern Rhodesia. This is the interwar period. And it's important to note here, Southern Rhodesia, what we would understand as Zimbabwe, is different than Northern Rhodesia or Nyasaland. So Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland become Zambia and one other country that I can't find in my notes right now. But, oh, here we go. Yes, the Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland are Zambia and... No, I lost it. Anyway, when we're talking about Southern Rhodesia, the colony of Southern Rhodesia, we're talking about Rhodesia. All right, that's all you got to understand. So important, just housekeeping note there, not to get people confused. There is Northern Rhodesia and there is Nyasaland, and they are separate things.
I want to kind of posit something about that. It is important that Rhodesia is legitimized and made a colony of the empire after World War One, because World War One, sort of awakens it awakens a spirit throughout the empire. We tend to think of World War One as sort of like the lost generation. We think of disillusioned veterans. We think of depressed people. We think of people like Ernst Jünger, Great Gatsby to some extent. Just the lost generation, people depressed, changed by war. And obviously, that war had a strain on these imperial powers, but at the same time, it also kind of sparked energy in the British Empire. Whether that be for, we're pro-empire or, anti-empire, and it has to do with the war. It has to do with men serving. We see, like India, for example, where basically, Indians patriotically enlisted and fought in the war. They fought in Africa and they fought in, the Western Front. And, they basically said, well, look, we were able to muster and do this. Well, why can't we be our own country? Why can't we have more rights? We see, pro in the white colonies such as, Rhodesia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. We see sort of a patriotic, but also sort of independent spirit of like, look at the pride of Canada, proud Canada's fighting men, strong Canada fighting for, imperial, progress. It's like they're proud of themselves. They're almost touting the line of, independence, but at the same time, they're, imperial loyalists. Whereas India, it's a little different, they're proud of themselves, but they're, kind of imperial separatists.
Right.
And now you got Ireland too at this time, which is under a civil war. Literally, 1916 had the Easter Uprising, where they pretty much came out on the cards and said, screw you, Britain. We're willing to die on the streets of Dublin for for independence. So it's kind of a positive for the British Empire in that extent that Rhodesia's made this colony after a devastating war, millions dead, millions spent. So it's kind of a positive, and it almost reinsures things are going to be fine for the empire. London has control. London has control of Africa, and they fought in Africa too. That's a huge thing that we don't think of. Now, the Allies were on the offensive in Africa, going against Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, in the German colonies with his Ascari. So these colonies, the British weren't too worried about on a grand scheme of bollocks, we might lose all our African colonies. But it kind of had a maybe an effect of we were able to maintain this land and hold it.
Yeah, no, that's all very, very important context to explain why this was happening at that time. And for what it's worth, I did find in my notes the two countries that Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia became Zambia and Malawi, or Malawi, however you say it. So to get it in your head in terms of the modern map, that's what those regions were called. But yeah, we good on that? I want to move on.
Yeah, I was good to make one quick note. I'm not too I wouldn't be too worried about the Maui or not Maui, Malawi thing. I know what you're talking about. I think I could be dead wrong on this, probably am, but I think that was a country that may have recently been made, or that was a kind of like a disputed, kind of like Lesotho.
Yeah, I think so. It was one of those, and I haven't studied any of the history of that country. I just know it comes into play later when we're talking about the lead up to the war, because the dissolution. Well, we'll get to it when we get to it, but
Yeah.
you'll see why I brought that up and I included that here.
No, you're good.
The next major political point I really have after the 1923 becomes a colony of the British Empire. 1924, they have the Southern Rhodesian general election. And this is where we got to talk about enfranchisement. So when the colony was set up, enfranchisement in Rhodesia technically was open to all races. However, the land there was it was not universal enfranchisement. There was property and material requirements to be a voting member of the body politic. So it basically effectively excluded all of the black population. And so at this period, and I have a chart here so people can actually see, the population of whites at this time period was about 50,000. And there's something like 5 or 6 million Black Native Africans living in Rhodesia. So you have not only minority rule, but like super minority rule, right? So you have a tiny, tiny proportion of the total population, that being the white population, controlling the government of Rhodesia. And I mean, when you talk about the reasons why that is, I mean, culturally, again, it's important to talk about the culture. The natives were still living in their traditional ways. So yes, enfranchisement was technically open to them under the constitution that they had. But because they were not living, they did not have the kind of conception of land ownership that the whites had. So, and this does come into play later in the 50s and 60s, but it just was basically, the black voting body was a non-entity for a variety of reasons, even though it was technically open to them. And then in 1930, there was the Land Apportionment Act, which is a significant piece of legislation in Southern Rhodesia during this period. It effectively racially segregated the land. So not effectively, it explicitly racially segregated the land. More or less half the land was allocated for whites and half the land was allocated for blacks. And so again, thinking about, you have 50,000 white people and 6 million black people, and the colonial government has allocated half the land for that tiny proportion of people. This is planting the seeds for what would become the Rhodesian Bush War, because in a country whose primary mode of economic existence is agriculture, that does not work out very well when 99% of your population does not have access to good land or land, period. The majority of the African population was confined to smaller, overcrowded, less productive areas known as native reserves or tribal trust lands. Africans were prohibited from owning land in the European areas and vice versa. And this significantly disrupted the traditional African agricultural practices. The overcrowding in the native reserves led to overgrazing, soil erosion, a decline in agricultural productivity, kind of contributed to widespread poverty. Some would say food insecurity among the African communities. And keep this in mind as we move forward, because this is in 1930. But later in the 50s and 60s, when reform attempts are made at this, and from everything I can tell, the reform attempts in the 50s and 60s were made in good faith, actually made things worse. And this law in 1930, and again, this is the Land Apportionment Act, really set the stage for that happening. And then again, you have to look at this again as stepping back into the old world. The intention of the Rhodesian colony was never to create some kind of multiracial kumbaya country. There was segregation. It was the white people moved there in the 1890s for the minerals. They stayed. They began to farm and take advantage of the good quality land that they apportioned for themselves. So there was never any attempt at some kind of racial harmony. It was purely segregationist. And again, try not to approach this with our modernist priors and how we think about segregation. These are two different groups of people. I think the best way to approach thinking about Rhodesia, the Rhodesian Bush War, is you have to understand the whites as a separate tribe. Indeed, they referred to themselves that way, and the black Africans understood them in a similar way. Again, going back to the tribal warfare, that older cultural idea, that way of existence. I think that's an important thing to understand from this.
Yeah, and on that note too, you kind of think about it in some ways, and this is going to be, a trend as we progress through this timeline leading up to the war. A lot of people from Europe are, coming here to Rhodesia. These are people that have probably never, seen an African. They're, they're coming there, and they're just their first interaction with them is going to be hostile. Um, you know, they might not be I mean, this is with every group, but somebody might not be mean spirited, but let's say you get to Rhodesia and the Matabele, are having an uprising and they're attacking your farm that you built. You're probably not going to like them, and your kids are probably not going to like them. Um, so there's a lot of in every war and everything, a lot of people that are affected by things, or people that that develop harsher views on certain things. I think a lot of it comes from just like a blank slate of their first experience with some group is negative. Um, that basically equates it to their negative. I don't mean that I know it sounds kind of simple and sounds kind of dumb, stupid, but I mean, what made me maybe start thinking this way is there's a movie out right now called Horizon: An American Saga, and the first part of the movie, spoiler alert by the way. So if you plan on watching it, might not, just be ready. But the beginning of the movie basically is about a group of settlers that just build this town out in like a camp out in the desert. and then immediately they're just attacked by Apaches. The Apaches, they know the military's out there. They know these settlers are coming in, and they basically, decide, well, they have to attack. They have to stop, the white man's expansion. Um, they don't really know what they're going up against, I don't think, but they just attack because they have to make, a move. They have to make a military move, and they end up attacking and massacring basically a site full of women and children, and some of them escape, but those settlers were like, not fighters. They were trying to come there and basically like farm cows. They weren't coming there to, kill, scalp, rape, and plunder. But after seeing that, they get attacked. That's what they set out to do. Some of the characters specifically, they set out for revenge. So you have to think of some of these, effects, some of these laws, some of these things are possibly coming from people that, they think, oh, I'll move to this place and have a better life. I'll get out of a factory in Europe and have a farm, open air, home range, in Africa. And they get there and they just start getting, attacked. So that probably
Yeah,
explains
no,
a lot.
that is a good point, and that'll actually tie into the next piece on this timeline, which is World War II. So, you know, in the first half of the 20th century, and my number was wrong. The black population in the first half of the 20th century, in the 1950s, the data I have is about 3 million black Africans living in Rhodesia. Um, World War II involvement of the Rhodesians was similar in size. I have 916 were killed, all races from Rhodesia serving with the British. But the major consequence of World War II for Rhodesia, and you can see it on this graph I have here, is white immigration to Rhodesia. So the population skyrockets. You go from having 50,000 at the beginning of the war to 300,000 at the peak in 1975. That starts at the end of World War II. But it isn't just the white population that's increasing, it's also the black population. So in the 1980s, Rhodesian black population was 8 to 9 million. So what you see in this time period is that whereas in the first half of the 20th century, you had a very segregated population, as the economy of Rhodesia grows and the population of Rhodesia grows, you have more industrialization, bigger cities, and you get basically a black serf underclass working for white farmers, working in factories, working in the urban areas. And so that's happening during this period. And the end of World War II significantly ramps this up. And so again, like you were saying, when you have the interaction of these groups no longer separated on, oh, okay, the black Africans are on their tribal trust lands and the whites are on their farms. And yeah, the laws that were passed were obviously to benefit the white settlers, and that wasn't good. But these folks, these groups were not in close proximity in the way that they were post 1945 as the population begins to grow. So that's an important part leading into the next thing. And so 1945, the war ends. 1948, you have the Bulawayo general strike. So this was a general strike of black workers in the city of Bulawayo, protesting the things that anybody would strike for: working conditions, wages, disenfranchisement. This is a population of underclass people working in the factories and on the farms, who don't have political representation. It's not a good situation. So they strike in 1948. So you already see the rumblings of revolution coming, right? You have the white super minority ruling over the black supermajority. And in 1948, Bulawayo general strike shuts down Bulawayo. I believe something like 16 black strikers were killed by police. And this is a trend that you will see the Rhodesian government practicing. Rather than acquiescing to protests and acquiescing to the concerns of the black majority, they tend to stifle them. And you'll see this later when, instead of trying to integrate the disruptive forces, the black nationalist forces, into the government, they just get rid of them. And part of this does go back to the fact that there is a history of violence between the white settlers and the black natives.
You good there, Peter? I can't hear you. I think your mic cut out.
What
If
was
you
the last thing you heard?
uh, I can't remember. You're talking about the strike. You're talking about the strike stuff. Better wages.
Okay. Can you hear me now, though?
Yes, I can hear you now. You're back on.
Okay, great. We are professionals, professional grade equipment. Yeah, Bulawayo general strike, heavy police crackdown, something like, a dozen, 15, 16, I believe is the exact number. Black strikers are killed by police in Rhodesia or in Bulawayo. And this kind of sets the precedent for how the Rhodesian government is going to deal with the discontent Black population. And later you'll see this with the Black nationalist groups. Rather than trying to integrate them into politics and kind of take the more diplomatic approach, they will take a heavy-handed approach. And surprise, that doesn't actually work that well when you're a super minority in the country and you're ruling the government by yourself. So do you have any points on that?
Mainly I was going to hit on that during this time that all this is going on is when the loaded term of decolonization is occurring.
Yes.
Across,
Yeah.
this is when I in that intro when I said the shadows of the, or not the shadows, but like the relics of the old world are being put off by the U.S. and the USSR, and Britain, it still has its empire. It emerges as victorious nation. It's not. I mean, yes, they were defeated in World War II. They were bailed out by America, but I mean, British forces land on the mainland Europe. They fight in Sicily. They fight in North Africa. They fight, decently, in the Pacific. They have honor gained, but it's an American, logistical, victories. But they on paper win, and it looks good. There's war heroes. There's things like that, and but during this time, decolonization is occurring. It's funny because it's like decolonization's happening, but at the same time, there's also immigration happening. Um, so, for example, I can't remember the name of the ship, but there was a ship from Jamaica that went to the United Kingdom, and it has a name. It's something like an S, but that was like the first kind of like signs of like what today in the West we would say is like the migration, like the third world migration, I guess you would call it. That
Mm-hmm.
was kind of like the first event of that. But generally, there's two waves of British decolonization. Um, Basically, the first wave, I believe, was like in 1945, and it set a basically like a 10-year plan for if I'm getting my numbers right. But one was in the 40s, and basically it set like a 10-year plan for like some of the colonies to get set up and get ready to be, their own governing nations. And then I believe there was one in 1956 where, Britain, this time, moved more rapidly to grant, independence to its African colonies. Um, because, while they are, doing decolonization, and there's, maybe these are the most level-headed people in the room, and the most caring people in the room. But it's obvious that you develop these semi-modern states, these semi-modern colonies, and places that the native people didn't have modern technology. They really don't know how to use it, and you're about to pull out all your resources. There's more or less going to be a, for lack of a better word, a humanitarian disaster that's going to occur, and they feel responsible if they have to ensure that this doesn't happen. They try this with India and Pakistan, and it like results in 1 million people getting killed by some Hindu Muslim like riot. Crazy, I know, but it happens. So Britain's trying to be slow about it, methodical, but kind of sort of like in I believe Enoch Powell's sentiment. He understood that the free world, aka the United States, more or less owned the rights to British politics, and America and its and what we're going to say anti-colonial kind of narrative and mythology and aspect, says basically, Europe, you're gonna drop those colonies now.
Right.
You're,
And, and
yeah, go ahead,
that's
go ahead.
that's an important point to. I know I've kind of everything I've said so far probably makes it seem like the white minority Rhodesian government were like the bad guys. And again, we're looking at this from with our modernist liberal American priors. But you have to understand the white Rhodesians understood, and they correctly understood, and history would prove this out, that black majority rule would spell disaster for Rhodesia because the economic backbone of the country was not the traditional agricultural practices of the millions of black natives. It was the minority of white farmers and miners and, the other, business owners that were existing there. And so they correctly understood this because and history would bear this out because the black sentiment was basically not only for enfranchisement but also for, to use a word from our political discourse, reparations, right? So you can't take the farms away from all the productive white farmers and expect the economy of Rhodesia to continue to exist. You can't have black majority rule in a country where white minority rule has been the status quo and been the backbone of their economy, and just flip a switch and all of a sudden you have majority voting and everything just works out fine. So the white Rhodesians, they might be looking like the bad guys here, but you have to come at it from their perspective. By the time 1948 rolls around and you have these strikes in Bulawayo, the Rhodesians living there are not European native. They're not native Europeans, minus the immigrants, of course, but the prevailing culture, these are people who were born there and raised there in Rhodesia. So, try to understand it from their perspective, like, yes, okay, it's super bad that we don't have full enfranchisement for everyone living within the territory of Rhodesia, but the existence of the Rhodesian economy itself, depends on the white minority rule. So they do see this as a threat, not only to their way of life in terms of their farms and their mines, but their existence as a culture, as a white Rhodesian identity itself is on the line if black majority rule becomes the law. So, and with that, can we actually take a quick bathroom break? I can pause this recording.
Yes,
All
that
right.
sounds good.
And we're back. But this is actually the same thing that you see in South Africa today, where, the productive white minority is being disenfranchised and their assets are being seized. Land is being redistributed. Large farms are made into smaller farms. It's the exact same thing that happened in Zimbabwe after the end of the Rhodesian Bush War, and the economy collapses. So, understand it from that perspective. Again, we're looking at this from the American perspective, where everybody needs to vote. Everybody, we need to have mass enfranchisement. Otherwise, it's just the worst thing in history. But again, this is Rhodesia is kind of a anachronism at the time. This is an old world culture and society existing in the 1950s, in the trying to come to terms with the post-war consensus of democratic liberalism. So
yes, and and something to kind of address, maybe sort of in some ways an elephant in the room that I've seen a lot of people in the past talk about with Rhodesia, and I said this to a friend actually today, talking in preparation for this, that a lot of people like to tout this idea of Rhodesia is like a kind of like a almost, they equate it to like the Confederacy or the Third Reich, if I can use that word. I don't know if I'm allowed to use that word, the way things are today, but I mean, and we'll get into more of it later in further episodes, but I mean, Rhodesia is not like this. I mean, simply boil it down to the whites in Rhodesia are not. They're not, national socialists. They're not. They're not like They're just people that like live there, trying to. They're pragmatists. I mean, every group in history more or less works like this. It makes sense that they would want to protect their own interests. I mean,
right, yeah, they were frontiersmen.
yes,
They had more in common with people in the Colorado Territory in the mid 1800s than they do with
Yes.
any of these. Well, this is what I call like, so to get off into a tangent, a dark tangent, I guess. There a while back, there was that, this is years ago now, there was a white guy who went and shot up and murdered a whole bunch of black folks at a church somewhere on the, I think it might have been in Virginia in the United States. And in some of the photos that came out of the shooter afterwards, he had a Rhodesian flag on his kit in one of these pictures that came out afterwards. And so Rhodesia, as it existed during this time period, really has gotten associated with this kind of like rabid white supremacist idea of like, oh, it was perfect until they just like you know, enfranchised black people. If you went there and talked to you know, your average Rhodesian living there at the time, that was not how they conceived of themselves. That was not how the society was set up. Again, this was a white tribe, and you had a region that existed with several tribes: the Matabele, the Shona, and the White Tribe. If you want to simplify it, boil it down like that, existing in different ways underneath a single government. And again, the colonial government, and much as we see with, you know, how the British redrew the maps in Northern Africa, the lines on the map that make Rhodesia were not, these were not like organic lines, right? This was a colonial creation, and you had a whole bunch of people, the Shona and the Matabele most notably, but then the White Tribe as well, the settlers, existing under a single government that never really should have been existing under a single government at all. So I think it is important to kind of touch on that, as you said, elephant in the room, because that's just like, people who think that just don't understand anything about
like you can
what
go
Rhodesia
back,
was.
I mean, you can go back and even get, you know, you can there's literally, you know, Bush War vets alive today. There's,
Oh
you
yeah.
know,
Oh yeah.
there's interviews at the time. You can even look at like the head honcho of the Rhodesian state, you know, Ian Smith himself. Not really, you know, I mean, obviously he wasn't a national socialist. I mean, he's a war hero. He literally was with the Italian resistance fighting, you know, the Germans. You know, he fought in the Alps and things like that. Fought in Italy. You know, renowned pilot, you know, too. And it's just like
Right.
it's like a lot of people want to like tout this idea of like Rhodesia as like some ideology. That's the word I was looking for.
Yes, it's the 20th century ideology is
Yeah,
what it is.
and
It's the, again, Rhodesia is a state out of time. It is a old world country in the 20th century, and that's why it was doomed to failure, you know, frankly, because like these ideologies are foreign to what Rhodesia was, because Rhodesia comes from a time before those things took hold on the world. So
yeah, it's just it just gets on my nerves. You know, it took me a while to kind of crack the code on it, but I mean, you go watch interviews, you know, of most of these Bush War vets, and I mean, it's simply like, why are we fighting? We're fighting communists. We're fighting Reds. Like,
right,
if we don't
right,
fight them, they nuke us. And it's like, yeah, there might be some, you know, colonial, you know, race sentiment, you know,
yeah,
backing it, but you know, back then, most people, you know, that you know were normal,
yeah.
um,
Well, let's
black
actually
or
put a
white,
pin.
were anti, you know, communist.
Let's put a pin in that, actually, because I have a lot to say on that, and it is simultaneously exactly what you're saying and exactly not what you're saying. But we have a little bit more of history to get to before we
Yeah,
get to the Rhodesian Bush War. So maybe we can breeze through some of these political, you know, goings on that lead up to the Bush War. So we
let's
left
roll.
off 1948. You have strikes going on, the beginnings of Black nationalist sentiments. 1951, you have the Land Husbandry Act. So it was a piece of legislation enacted by the government of Southern Rhodesia during the colonial period. It had significant impacts on land use and ownership that particularly affected the African population. So it did things like reorganize the land. It implemented a land registration system. It forced people to consolidate their land holdings. It forced African farmers to change their agricultural practices to reduce you know, land, you know, basically land mismanagement. So things like contour ridging, crop rotation, they forcibly decrease the size of cattle herds to prevent overgrazing. So this was a reform act, this 1951 Land Husbandry Act. It was designed to improve the economic situation of Rhodesia as a whole, but actually in particular the black farmers. But the problem is when you, again, and this goes back to the 1930 law, you have these groups of people who at this time are still living a very, what you might call Neolithic lifestyle. These are relatively primitive subsistence farming. They are involved in the economy, but it's not to the degree that, certainly anything like the United States or any Western country was at this time. Most of these African villages are practicing some level of subsistence farming. And so what this act does is angers the African population, but also completely disrupts their farming practices that they had going back to, hundreds of years, but also especially since the 1930 Act. And then when you look at things like the registration of land rights, this required African farmers to have formal documentation for the land they occupied and used. These are people who live in mud huts and have been farming these lands for generations. Do you think that they have these kinds of paperwork? Like, no, of course not. It's absurd. The Rhodesian government's trying to bring Rhodesian agriculture into the 20th century. I almost said into the 21st century. They're trying to modernize it, but again, you're trying to modernize an economy that is stuck in the 1800s. It doesn't work that way. And so this significantly contributed to the social and political tensions in the 1950s. And to the African population, from their perspective, it was seen as a tool of disenfranchisement and control. Maybe I think it's pretty clear. I think the historical record is pretty clear that this was done in good faith by the white minority government. But the actual impacts were not good, and it's significantly contributed to the destabilization of Rhodesia. Next major point is the Malayan emergency. So not to get off into a huge tangent on that, but Malayan emergency, British were fighting an insurgency war in Malaya. The Rhodesians sent troops over there to support the British Empire. And those troops then came back at the end of the Malayan emergency and were reintegrated into Rhodesia's military force. So that does play a part into the upcoming Bush War. But 1953, we have the Central African Federation, also known as the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which includes Southern Rhodesia, which Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, what we're talking about, Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which are Zambia and Malawi, respectively. So this is where that comes back into play. So you have basically three separate colonial nations pooled together in an effort to combine their markets and their resources and boost the economy of all three colonies. The economy was prosperous for a time because of the post-World War II boom. But the African population generally opposed it because they feared they would not be able to achieve self-government with the kind of federal structure that this federation had set up that was, again, dominated by the white Southern Rhodesian minority. That dissolved in 1963, but in the meantime, there were attempted reforms under the progressive Prime Minister, Sir Garfield Todd, which included things like increased funding for black schools, the appellation, how do you say it? Basically calling people Mr. instead of AM. So in, legal parlance in Rhodesia, African males were differentiated. You didn't call them Mr., you would call them AM. That was their prefix for African male. Obviously very disenfranchising to the black population. And again, you can look at this however you would prefer. I mean, if you're more liberal or progressive, you're going to say, well, this is just a element of white supremacy. But again, I think it's important to recognize that this is a land out of time. This is a holdover from a colonial era. But I mean, they're going to call that white supremacy too. So whatever, do with that information what you will. Sir Garfield Todd also presided over the creation of multiracial trade unions. And he really kind of alienated himself from the white settler community because in 1960, he shared a platform with the African nationalist leader Joshua Nkomo and jointly appealed to the British government to suspend Rhodesia's colonial constitution. So he was really like, Rhodesian shitlib of his day, if you want to say that. So, he was the prime minister. This is not like he was not some minority, but he ultimately was forced out because he was basically paving the way to black enfranchisement and black majority rule. And he was in office from 1953 to 1958. So in 1957, Joshua Nkomo founded the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress, ANC for short. This is going to come into play later when we talk about the war itself. So remember that name, Joshua Nkomo, and that's in 1957. And at this time, counterinsurgency training began. As Rhodesian Far East Volunteer Unit troops, which these were the guys that I was talking about who went out to Malaya to help the British Empire in the Malayan emergency. As they came back, they had just been fighting an insurgency war. It was kind of on the horizon that something like that would be happening in Rhodesia. Discontent and political strife was growing. Black Bolshevism loomed is the term that they were using. So again, you think the 1950s, right? This is the beginning of the Cold War. Korea is going on. Red Scare, exactly. So they're seeing this and they're saying, oh, this is like third worldist communist revolution could come to Rhodesia. So you have the Rhodesian military, which is quite small, begin to focus on counterinsurgency training at this time. And then you also have to remember in the Belgian Congo, right? I don't know how much you know or anyone listening would know about the Belgian Congo, but there was like mass murder of Belgian white settlers in the Congo at this exact same time.
Yes.
So all across Africa, these colonies are falling apart and white people are just getting murdered.
That's a thing across, why decolonization is kind of important because, the British Empire might be, kind of sort of having, peaceful, I say peaceful, semi-peaceful,
semi-peaceful
decolonization.
controlled.
But places like Portugal, the government of Lisbon is literally like spying on Africans, making sure they're not, going to, do terrorist attacks in their colony.
Right.
And then you have, France fighting, a war in, Algeria. They're not fighting Africans; they're fighting, Arabs.
Right.
But it's that. You have there was something else in my mind to consider. Oh yeah, the Belgians.
This is rolling the headless Thompson gunner time period.
You have the the Katanga crisis that it occurs, I believe, a year before the Bush War, and it goes on like during the early parts. But I mean, you're already starting to see, these, half of these, colonies are already, gone native, if I can say that. They're not European.
Yeah, the writing is on the wall for the
yes. So the Congo, is like a mess. You have, these tribal groups fighting, starting to fight each other, starting to squabble for power, while at the same time you have, the good old United States and, the Russian, bear, trying to, exert influence, trying to fight, it's like there's like two different things going on. There's decolonization, but then there's also, ideological colonization of, communism and, capitalism. And it's not helping either. And, places like Belgian Congo, they're literally fighting a war that, is going to see, like the employment of, groups like, Commando Force 5, if you know them, people like Mike Hoare, Robert Denard, men that, have, ironically, even though this is the Third Reich was defeated, people like Robert Denard were part of the, the French Third Positionist movement. People like him and Dominic Venner, they were cutting their teeth, in Africa, trying to fight third world communism. But at the same time, a lot of these mercenary types were not, they were not exactly, pro democracy, pro capitalism like we think. They're more on a third positionist line. And I mean, if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And I'm just going to end there on that.
Yeah, no. Yeah. I think most people listening will pick up on that. So this is the 1950s. 1959, the Unlawful Organizations Act banned the African National Congress and other African nationalist parties. They did this repeatedly. So the African Nationalist Congress, African National Congress, got banned. So they came up with a new name, formed a new party, got banned again, and they did this like several times. So going back to what I was talking about with the 1948 Bulawayo strike, this is a pattern that the Rhodesian government is following, right? Rather than trying to, extend an olive branch, they're cracking down. And again, understandably so, given the violence that is happening. But hindsight 2020, maybe this was not the best move. But this is what they do. So they ban the ANC. Their leaders are effectively, I think, not quite yet, but their leaders will eventually end up going into exile. And then you get the formation of ZAPU, which is let me make sure I get this right, the Zimbabwe African People's Union. And this is one of the major militant groups that will end up fighting in the Rhodesian Bush War. And that is still led by Joshua Nkomo. And then later you get ZANU, which is a breakaway group led by, I'm not even going to try and pronounce his first name, but his last name is Sithole. So Sithole. Remember these two groups, ZAPU and ZANU. So ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, that is the Nedabili Black nationalist militant group, what the Rhodesians would refer to them as terrorists. ZANU is the breakaway group led by Sithole, and they are the Shona. Okay. So later, and we'll get to this, in future episodes, but it's very important because as with every third world communist uprising, these groups spend about as much time fighting each other as they end up fighting the Rhodesians. And when they eventually win, that fighting does not end, and there is what can only be described as a genocide following the end of the Rhodesian Bush War when one of these groups does win.
It doesn't help either that I know that the Sino-Soviet split hasn't occurred yet. It will occur during the Bush War, during the heavy years of the Bush War, the 70s. But I believe ZANU was backed by China.
Yes, I believe that is correct.
Was backed by the Soviet Union, and that I believe it was China stuck their hand out first to get ZANU training, and
yes.
I think that those trainings were going on like in Beijing.
Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. So at this time period, it's very small numbers from my understanding from this Rhodesian War military history book that I have. Very small numbers of Black nationalist guerrillas were being sent from Rhodesia abroad, but they were training in Cuba, in Beijing, in Russia. I mean, there were guerrillas, small numbers, but numbers nonetheless, were training all over in every communist state, training to go fight the upcoming guerrilla war that was on the horizon in Rhodesia at this time. So, I mean, think about that, right? Think about if you're in whatever Western country you're living in, right? In the United States, if it's kind of an open secret that there are people leaving the country to go train for a guerrilla war, right? Like what that spells for your political future as a country, the peace was kind of, a foregone war was a foregone conclusion at this point.
That's kind of ironic that to some degree that you're saying that because especially after today's events, I think everybody knows that especially in the United States, the elephant in the room is kind of sort of these two polar opposite political dynamics. I'm not saying civil conflict on Republican versus Democrat lines. That's stupid.
Yeah, but we are no longer in the realm of democratic politics.
Oh, of course. And,
yeah.
and at
there's no talking point, anymore.
Those things represent, they represent more or less. I mean, do they represent different political, trying to think of a word to use for it.
The ideological gap. Yeah, exactly. Yes. There's the ideological gap is a chasm. You can't cross that.
And it's anymore, like Scott Walker or Ted Cruz isn't going to go pick up a weapon and go fight Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. She's not the prime example to use for a leftist, but We'll
Right.
just use her because she was a Democrat politician. Um, that's not going to happen. And, and at the same time, those, like people like Scott Walker, people like Ted Cruz, they're not political hardliners, but their followers and their voters are mostly. So in any kind of situation like that, the and I guess you could apply this to the Bush War. That might be why I was going on it because I kind of lost my origin.
No, I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, this is
Yeah,
like they say war. What did Clausewitz say, right? War is the
yeah,
extension of politics by other means.
yes.
When the diplomatic, peaceful means of conflict resolution have dissipated, you're only left with war, and that is exactly what's happened here. And even though this is still years out from the formal beginning of the Rhodesian Bush War, I mean, we're talking 1959, 1960 here. I mean, this is what's happening.
People know something's coming. There was a tidal wave coming. It might be a year, few years away from the shoreline, but it's so big everybody can see it.
Right.
My analogy I was using earlier is that the politics is sort of almost like the face of the movements they represent. So even with Rhodesia, or with the different factions there, their leaders might tout certain things, but they're the if you can get this analogy, they're the people leading might be ones, but the people behind them might be twos.
Right.
I hope that
No,
makes
yeah.
sense.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. Yeah. So moving on in 1960, the Rhodesian government passes the Law and Order Maintenance Act and the Emergency Powers Act, which basically declared a state of emergency with the civil unrest going on in the country. It gave the government and the police sweeping powers. It set harsh criminal penalties for basically involvement with the African nationalist groups. You had censorships, or massive censorship, something like 1,100 or 1,200 Black nationalist organizers and politicians were arrested and thrown in jail, detainments to the tune of thousands. At the same time, mind you, there are hundreds of thousands of card-carrying party members, like African native party members, who are members in these Black nationalist parties. I mean, paying dues, right? There's tens of thousands of people attending these political rallies. So there's this populist movement going on, and it's not going anywhere, but the government is trying their best by cracking down on it to get rid of it. Which, again, if you ever find yourself, in charge of a third world country and you have something like this going on, let this be a lesson to you that, when you have a massive populist uprising, cracking down on it, let them eat cake is not a very good way to go about ameliorating things. So that's happening. 1960, Emergency Powers Act, Law and Order Maintenance Act. At this time, the Rhodesians are still training with the British Empire. Remember, the Rhodesia is still a British colony, but independence is looming because, as we've been talking about this whole time, the British are willingly dismantling their own empire. They're supporting majority rule in their former colonies, and like we mentioned, at the same time, small numbers of Black natives are going abroad to train as guerrillas with the communists. So this is a very strange situation where you have a ostensibly Western government, the British, trying to slowly and carefully dismantle their empire, while the communists are actively supporting and arming and training guerrillas who at this time are already developing weapons caches and plans of attack. Like they're buying bullets and stocking up on beans at this time, right? Like this isn't, they're not just, going abroad training. I mean, they're fully expecting this to break out into a war, and they are burying weapons and ammunition in preparation for it. So at this point, peaceful resolution has been eliminated by the government crackdown. Militant leaders have begun to fill the vacuum of leadership left by these crackdowns. So where you once had maybe the more moderate leaders of these Black nationalist groups, they get arrested or they go into exile, and now you get the militant people stepping up to take their place. You have large-scale riots break out in Bulawayo in 1960, and again, Africans are killed in this riot. 1962, the Rhodesian Front Party won elections under Winston Field. So this demarcates a major shift from the more moderate Rhodesian white political parties to the Rhodesian Front Party, which, when a political party has the name Front in its name, you can bet that they're pretty hardline and radical. The Rhodesian Front Party was absolutely opposed to black majority rule under any circumstance. And then the following year, the federation was dissolved. So Zambia and Malawi gained independence as their own nations, and Southern Rhodesia as a colony is left by itself. And again, this is because the government of Rhodesia, while technically still part of the British Empire, is very heavily leaning towards independence. So the British Empire couldn't just go in and say, hey, you guys are going to be an independent country now, and you guys are going to have black majority rule like they did in Zambia and Malawi. That was not happening in Rhodesia. After the Federation dissolves in 1963, ZAPU and ZANU are outright banned. So this is following in the same line of the bannings that have been happening. The leaders many of the leaders are imprisoned. Nkomo and Sithole go into exile in their respective parts of the country. So I believe Nkomo went into exile in, Mozambique? Or do I have that backwards? Zambia. Yeah, he went into exile in Zambia, and Sithole went into exile in Mozambique. And so again, going back to this first page that we have here, this breakdown of the tribal groups, the Matabele and the Shona, is basically how the ZAPU-ZANU breakdown went, because it was mostly along tribal lines. Again, Rhodesia is a country out of time. These are third world communist groups, but they're not fighting for some kind of like distilled version of Marxist ideology. They're basically wearing communist revolution as a skin suit for their own ethnic animus and their own drive for independence, which is very common. You see this all the time in the kinds of Cold War era communist revolutions. Like, yeah, they're technically communists. And this is going back to what you were talking about earlier, Otto. The Rhodesians thought they were fighting the Reds and the terrorists. But the black nationalists didn't really care about communism. There's actually a very interesting anecdote in one of the books that I've read about Rhodesia, where it was a captured note from one of the political commissars that was attached to a guerrilla group. And it was basically like, it was like a handful of bullet points that were poorly written, very incoherent, trying to explain like socialist ideology, because you have this political commissar attached to a guerrilla group going out into the bush to some village preaching about communism, but the black natives there don't really care about communism, and neither does the commissar, and he doesn't really understand it. But like, we're ostensibly communists and we're being armed and funded by bloc governments, so we're kind of communist, but really these are just black nationalist groups. But this is the time period that they exist in, where you have West versus East, you have Western free world versus communism. So that's how that ends up playing into Rhodesia.
The same thing's going on kind of like too with, there is a Cold War shadow going on with that. And, the conflict in Vietnam is starting to heat up, which was by far the deadliest conflict of the Cold War. And you're seeing a lot of that. I mean, like, Ho Chi Minh, for example, he's, the founder, he's the founder of the Vietnamese Communist Party, but, he's also the founder of the French Communist Party. He's like one of the like three founders, I believe, of it. And when he started the communist revolution in Vietnam, what became North Vietnam, he actually went to the people in Paris, the communists there, try to get basically a French communist support to help third world communists. And it's kind of ironic because they basically told him, like, no, we're anti-colonial. We don't even want to put our hands on Vietnam. That's your thing. And in a lot of the same ways that we're seeing, mainly nativist movements in Africa, a lot of the stuff out of Vietnam was mainly, more or less doing for Vietnam, not for, Marx. So when we kind of study these, Cold War conflicts of, these places, don't exactly think the nativist side is, exactly red. They're red, but reds means something different to them than red means something to us.
Yeah, exactly. Sense. Yeah. So 1963, like I said, ZAPU-ZANU, they get banned, and this is where the guerrilla war really starts. I don't know what date we set or is recognized at the beginning of the Bush War. But once Nkomo and Sithole go into exile, they both begin to wage campaigns of violence, primarily against whites with the farm attacks, which is, again, we talked about this going back with the first Chimurenga. You see this still in South Africa today. This is a common tactic. It was said, I don't know if it was one of these two men who the quote comes from, or if it was just from one of their spokespeople, but it was said that for every black, for every one of our people, meaning the black natives killed, the black nationalists were going to kill whites with interest, was the word that was used. So they are waging war against against the white settler population in the rural areas, beginning at this point. In 1964, Winston Field, who was the prime minister, resigns, and he's succeeded by Ian Smith, who is staunch advocate for independence from Britain. And in the 1965 general election, the Rhodesian Party under Ian Smith sweeps 79% of the vote. And this is where it gets interesting with the British politics. So it's not clear at this point what the British would do if the Rhodesians declared independence, or if the Rhodesians had the will or the ability to resist a British invasion. Because keep in mind, these Rhodesians primarily consider themselves British. Yes, there's been a lot of immigration, but it's primarily been Anglo immigration. So from South Africa, from Britain proper, from Australia, some from America, but it's mostly from the Anglosphere. So these people are still loyal to Britain. They had fought, a lot of the soldiers had fought in Malaya with the British. World War II was not that long ago, very in recent memory. So, the idea that we're going to declare independence and then, oh, what if the British invade? Are we going to fight the British? I mean, we are British, more or less. So that question was up in the air. And the black nationalists hung a large part of their strategy on getting the British to intervene militarily at this time, but also later. So the black nationalists basically thought, well, we're going to force the Rhodesians to declare independence against the British. The British are going to intervene. The British are going to take care of everything. There will be peace. And then we'll have black majority rule, and that'll be that. That obviously did not happen. And the black nationalists actually kind of hung their strategy on British intervention well into the 1970s, until they figured out that, like, oh no, we're just going to have to win this war because the British are not invading Rhodesia. It's just not going to happen.
That's kind of crazy that they thought that was going to, I mean,
it's not crazy though, because look at what happened in all the other British colonies, right? Britain was committed to majority rule in all their colonies. They were committed to dismantling their colonies. They did it in Nyasaland. They did it in Northern Rhodesia. So,
But at the end of the day, it's like, I guess what I'm pointing at is that I find it hard to imagine that Britain would, send troops to put down a, basically fellow, whites, just trying to, it is basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I would think it would make, I guess because it played out like this in real life, the best thing they could do is, oh, well, it's kind of like, in America with the Supreme Court, they can rule something, but they don't have to nobody has to enforce it or whatever. I feel like it was probably something more on those lines of, we told them not to do it. No, like slap on the wrist. But at the end of the day, it's like, was Britain willing to let, white Britons fight white African Britons? I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I think in a different time period, had this happened in 1905 or 1910 instead of 1965, I think the British probably would have invaded.
Oh, definitely.
But, the British had been decimated in World War II, and they have been since relegated basically to the status of a suzerain state of the United States Empire, of the American Empire. So I don't think they had the will or the military power at this point to do anything about it. And they didn't, because 11th of November, 1965, unilateral Declaration of Independence is declared. Britain declines to invade, although they do, I don't know if they immediately do it, but they later initiate blockades preventing shipments of things like oil, any kind of armament. Well, they do sanction military arms and material that was destined for Rhodesia at the time of UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, are immediately impounded, going from Britain to Rhodesia. So they do begin a kind of policy of blockading the Rhodesians and trying to starve them out. And even though the British declined to invade and start a war that way, what UDI signaled functionally was the beginning of the Civil War, because, you know, the Black nationalists were expecting that the British Empire was going to take care of this. The white minority government declares independence. I mean, what else is there to do, right? This is like the trumpet call of the Civil War is UDI.
Yeah, that's fundamentally correct. You know, because this is not a linear war. You know, there's no declaration exactly.
Right.
It just starts. I mean, it's you know, one side is, you know, the Rhodesian security forces, and the other is, you know, just basically political organizations. You know, they just, you know, it just starts happening. You know, just attacks start happening. Um, you know, I mean, there will be battles. I mean, there'll be battles, but it just kind of sort of, you know, it's an insurgency. It's not like, you know, oh, they're going to, you know, take, you know, these towns and march on here and there. You know, it's about basically, you know, winding the security forces down to the bush.
Right.
Um, you know, and, you know, basically causing a state of terror. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
terrorism is. And
Well, do you want to talk about the first battle? Because I have a very funny anecdote. I think it's funny.
well,
Funny anecdote about the first battle of.
you can. I was we could maybe touch on that. I wanted to save that for, you know, when we talk, you know, like our second part on the movements of the war, you know, major battles, things like that. But, you know, you've got it up here, so, you know, you might as well talk about
I
it.
think we should, and I think you'll see why once I explain this little anecdote. So, 28th of April, 1966. It's celebrated now as Chimurenga Day in Zimbabwe. 21 ZANU insurgents, so 3 squads, 3 sections, infiltrate from Zambia to attack infrastructure and white farmers. A 7-man squad was surrounded by police on Hunyani Farm near Sinyoa. The insurgents were wiped out by the Rhodesian forces. It was the first real contact of the war. And I'm going to read a quick excerpt here from the Stackpole Military History Series book, because it's funny about basically how bad everybody involved was at fighting. Let me see. Yeah, here we go. So this is directly quote, Chapter 2, page 29 of the Rhodesian War and Military History. In April 1966, a group of 21 ZANU insurgents infiltrated from Zambia into Rhodesia, and they split up into 3 teams. Their aim was to cut power lines and attack white farmsteads. One group, dubbed the Armageddon Group, was surrounded by police. I already told you guys all that. They were wiped out by Rhodesian forces, who suffered no casualties. The ZANU leaders grossly exaggerated the incident at the time. You know, they were propping it up as a propaganda thing. And it does now occupy a place of pride in Zimbabwe. But it was basically a complete joke because all 7 heroes of the revolution who died at this battle were being fed by police special branch. So this is basically like the CIA of the Rhodesians. And the political commissar himself of the squad was a Rhodesian agent who was being, you know, propped up by the Central Intelligence Organization. So the guerrillas were supposed to lead the security forces to armed caches and to nationalist sympathizers in the area. But basically, because of a mix-up, the security forces there didn't know that these guys were actually double agents. And so they were all killed. And they weren't killed in some kind of like tactical, you know, near ambush or something like that. They had an Air Force gunner in an Alouette airplane, I'm not sure if that's an airplane or a helicopter. That'll be for the next episode.
Probably a
For us to
helicopter.
research. I think it is. But he shot 168 rounds to kill one guy out of a MAG, which is, you know, which is basically a M240 Bravo in American parlance. The regular and reserve policemen involved in the hunt were mostly armed with World War I vintage rifles and Second World War revolvers. According to one eyewitness, it was nothing more than a baboon shoot, the police reservists congregating like farmers, which most of them were, around every kill and exposing themselves unbelievably to enemy fire. The history of the Rhodesian Air Force commented thus on its first kill in the war. It was a very unconvincing and unprofessional action. Fortunately for the police, the guerrillas were too confused to take advantage of the inexperience of the hunters. Another Rhodesian commander described the response as a shambles. So, yeah, basically a complete just cock up by everybody involved.
Yeah.
I thought that was funny. That's how the war actually formally begins. And it doesn't stay so comically tame for long, as we will find out in the next episode.
No, it does not. It does not at all. You will see as the war progresses, we'll go from these quote unquote baboon shoots of basically coffee and donut cops shooting mistaken double agents. We'll see that go from that to killer SAS commandos, not British SAS, but Rhodesian SAS commandos launching serious operations in extremely one-sided battles that just don't even seem real.
Yeah, there's some crazy anecdotes, and I'm really excited for the next couple of episodes to talk about that stuff, because this was the boring episode, if we're being honest. The exciting stuff that everybody wants to know about the Rhodesian War, I mean, that's what we're going to get into in the next couple episodes.
Yes.
And there's some stories to be told, that's for sure.
There'll be plenty of bush strokes, FALs,
lots of FALs,
yes,
lots of MAGs,
just these crazy battles, and some of the more boring and maybe not boring but depressing aspects of the war. That will be the dark, gritty, material stuff of the combat will be what is next.
Yes, yeah.
So do you want to leave it here, Peter?
Otto, I think not too bad. Bit of a bang up job, but I think we did pretty good. We're basically professionals now, so not bad for a first episode.
Not bad at all.
Yeah. All right. This has been the first episode of Bush War. Signing off. Do we have like a thing that we say at the end? We need a thing. We'll come up with it for next time.
I just say for the people listening, just continue to support our channel.
We got to do plugs, right? We got to do plugs.
Yes, you can follow me on Twitter at Otto Hawker. Let me get that completely right. I forget that. Yeah, at Otto Wolfhelmsen. That is Otto with a capital O, Wolf, but with a U instead of an O. The W is a capital as well. Wolfhelmsen on Twitter. I have a Robin Hood looking profile pic. That's me. I'll be posting updates on what we're doing and what possibly we might plan in the future. But thank you for listening. And Peter?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Peter_C_Thistle. I'm also on Substack. I read a Substack called Parry This. As Thomas says, seek and ye shall find. I mean, just look it up. We're in the information age. But should I plug the Old Glory Club? I feel like I should. Go join the Old Glory Club.
Yes, go find your nearest Old Glory Club chapter. Go find your nearest if you're in a basket weaving Discord, I also encourage you to go find those people in there, meet up with them. We know that
cool people,
the enemy wants us not meeting in real life. They want us online, doing only online things, and online serves its purpose, but we know at the end of the day, connections and bonds are formed through, eye-to-eye, hand-to-hand contact. Socks are on, so no homo.
Yeah, for sure.
But you can also find me on Substack at Wolfhelm. I might be trying to change the name to Otto on that if I can, but if not, it's Wolfhelm. So yeah, I encourage you to find me, find Peter, and give us a like and a subscribe, and stay up to date on what we'll be doing next.
Yeah. All right, man. This was fun.
Thank
Until
you,
next
Peter.
time.
Yes, sir. Till next time. Be safe out there.
All right. Good night.
Good night.